Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football, a massive Big 12 matchup. BYU heading on the road to play Arizona State in a football game where both of these teams just a couple months ago were picked to finish almost dead last in the Big 12 in late August. Now find themselves late November playing not only with Big 12 championship implications on the line, we're talking about legitimate college football playoff implications as well. Kenny Dillingham, what he's doing with this Arizona State program, it's a masterclass. And then you look at BYU and say, I would describe it as a frustrating loss against Kansas. Just finished rewatching the game this morning. You look at the numbers and say BYU gained more than 100 yards than Kansas, had 10 more first downs, controlled the time possession. If you were to cover up the scoreboard and just kind of show me the box score numbers, BYU was the better football team in that game. It kind of came down to, and this has been the story for BYU. They've done a lot of the little things right throughout 2024. They didn't do a lot of the little things right against Kansas, and that was kind of the difference with Kansas team that's kind of catching fire late down the stretch. Can BYU bounce back? Can they play their best football on the road here? BYU coming in as 3.5-point dogs against Arizona State. Fired up to get into this one now. Before we do, and as always, BYU fans, Arizona State fans, let it fly in the comment section. A lot of different ways you can look at this football game. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. Talking the Big 12 this year has been an absolute blast. These games are consistently phenomenal football games. I think we're going to get another good one at Arizona State this weekend. Now, without further ado, let's get into this one. I want to start with this Arizona State offense versus the BYU defense that's been very good all year. And quite frankly, outside of that first drive against Kansas, was very good if the rest of the football game against Kansas. I thought they tackled extremely well. They did not give up a lot of explosive plays. Those are the two things that you're looking at. Kenny Dillingham knows how to scheme it up, and it's really not a secret what Arizona State is going to try to do in this football game. They want to run the football with Cam Scatterbo. Now, you look at Cam and say 66 missed tackles forced on the year. One of the biggest storylines for this football game, team tackling. Arizona State fans know this. I'm guessing BYU fans know this as well at this point, too. One person is not taking down a guy like Cam Scatterbo. You got to rally to the football. You got to have multiple guys trying to tackle this. Do not, to BYU's credit, this has been a really good tackling football team all year in 2024. So that might be a matchup that favors BYU. They're going to get Cam involved in a lot of different ways. They're going to get him out in space. They're going to get him between the tackles. You got to make sure you're bringing this kid to the ground, which is easier said than done. Can BYU bring Cam Scatterbo to the ground? I think the second storyline is Sam Levitt, the Michigan State transfer, has been excellent for Arizona State. And I think the biggest storyline is he's not putting the ball in harm's way. He's only got 4 interceptions on the year, only 3 turnover-worthy plays according to PFF. This is something BYU wants to do. They've been really, really good at being an opportune defense, and when you put the ball in harm's way, you're going to pay for it. If Sam Levitt does put the ball in harm's way, can BYU continue to capitalize on some of those mistakes and create some of those game-changing defensive turnovers? And I think lastly, what you're looking at is Arizona State wants to push the ball down the field. They're going to run the football a lot. They run the football 60% of offensive snaps. That's top 20 in the country. They want to go play action. They want to push the ball down the field. A very similar offense in terms of how they want to do things than what you just saw at Kansas. And if BYU can replicate that performance on defense outside of that first drive, I think BYU's in a spot to maybe give Arizona State some trouble on the offensive side of the football. Now you flip over, and this has kind of been the struggle for BYU the last couple of weeks, right? Jake Rett's left, this BYU offense. I think they're struggling with two things. And upon rewatching that Kansas game, there's kind of two things that I'm looking at. Well, let's start with Arizona State's defense real quick. This is a very solid unit. You go back to last year and say they didn't have the guys during Kenny Dillingham's first year. Like that roster was decimated with all the junk that was going on off the field. They just didn't have the dudes that were big, strong, fast to be a very solid defense. They've been much better, and you can kind of tell this defense from an athleticism standpoint is a little bit different. And they've been very solid. You take a look at the numbers, only allowing 23 points per game. That's top 40 in the country. BYU struggles on offense. I think this is the biggest storyline in this football game. Can they get out of the rut that we've seen them kind of get into the last 2 weeks. There's kind of two or three things that I want to focus on. And number one, you got to find explosive plays. Like we all know how hard it is for college football offenses to just work the football down the field, go 10 to 12 plays, 80 yards, and score a touchdown. Because there's a lot of bad things that can happen between those 12 plays, right? Negative plays, penalties, turnovers. You got to be able to find those chunk plays. Instead of going 8 to 10 plays, 80 yards, and scoring touchdowns, can you go 4 for 80 yards and go score? In order to do that, you got to find explosive plays. You look at this BYU off against Kansas, they had 2 plays that went over 20 yards. That's not good enough, especially against the Kansas defense that ain't that good. And they had some opportunities. You just got to, I mean, if you want to win football games at the highest level, when you have those opportunities to hit those home run explosive plays, you got to make them happen. And I think BYU just failed to do that against Kansas. That was the biggest storyline. I think, secondly, you got to get Jake Retzlaff's legs involved. And it hasn't really been a factor the last 2 weeks. And part of the reason why I'm so high on this kid is, yeah, he can get it done. There's some inconsistencies with the accuracy, but he can have an arm that makes a lot of different throws. But the other dimension that this kid brings in terms of what he can do with his legs, it was a massive feature for BYU earlier in the season. Now, the last 2 games against Utah, against Kansas, they really haven't gotten Jake Retzlaff involved as an athlete. I'm not saying Jake Retzlaff's Lamar Jackson, but I am saying he is a quarterback that makes defenses respect what he can do athletically. Now, for whatever reason, they're not involved in Jake Retzlaff like that anymore as a runner, as a guy that can create. I'd like to see them get back to that. I think when you look at BYU's offensive performances, say, when have they looked the best on offense? It's when Jake Retzlaff is being a difference maker, not only as a thrower of the football, but as a guy that can be an athlete and test defenses with his legs as well. Secondly, get guys in space. And this is kind of how you can evaluate if an offense is healthy or not. Healthy, not in terms of like actually being healthy, but like an offense that is thriving. That's kind of what I mean. Yards after the catch. How well is an offense creating space for their playmakers? Just didn't seem like BYU got to that really the last 2 games either. You look at the game against Kansas, only 81 yards after the catch all game. That's not good enough. You have to get your playmakers in space and allow them to get after it after the catch. That's how you find a lot of those explosive plays. There's 2 ways to create explosives. One, pushing the ball down the field. But I think secondly, like, get your guys in space, let them operate after the catch, make some people miss an open field. That's another avenue to create explosive plays. And it just didn't seem like BYU created much space for their offense to operate. I think Jake Retzlaff has to be better. I would like to see the offensive play calling get a little bit better and ask Jake Retzlaff's clearly his best version when he's being an athlete. Go let him be an athlete. That's kind of my takeaway from that Kansas game. Now, getting into the pick here, I think this is fascinating. BYU catching 3.5 points. I'm going to take BYU with those points. I think this is going to be a phenomenal football game that probably comes down to the end of the game and what teams make some plays. Historically, we've seen BYU be that team that makes plays in the fourth quarter to win football games. They didn't do it against Kansas, but you still have a lot of confidence that they can do it in a close game, 3.5 point spread. Give me BYU to bounce back, but this is going to be a phenomenal game. And I don't think many people had this on their bingo cards in terms of BYU, Arizona State, college football playoff implications on the line. I think both of these programs should be fired up about where these teams are and what we're looking like going into Saturday. We'll close it out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.